Alexander, Athenagoras, Michael, Spiridon, and Demetrius. We really do have a distinguished panel today. We will start with a presentation on Archbishop Alexander by Dr. Demetrius Skedros. He's already been introduced to you, one of our beloved professors of our campus, and someone who is just absolutely full of knowledge, both in realms of the Archdiocese and within Byzantine history. We will then move on to a presentation by Mr. Matthew Namey on Archbishop Athenagoras. Matthew Namey is the editor of Orthodox History, where he's been blogging about church history for the past 13 years. By day, he is a lawyer working exclusively on Orthodox matters for a nonprofit called Orthodox Ministry Services. He lives in Washington State with his wife and their 6 children. Following that, we will have a presentation on Archbishop Michael by Father Makarios Niakaros. Father Niakaros is the Proistamenos of Holy Apostles Greek Orthodox Church in Haverhill, Massachusetts. He is a graduate of Holy Cross and earned his doctorate from the University of Thessaloniki. His dissertation, which has been published in both Greek and in English, is on Archbishop Michael of America. Following that, we will have a presentation by Mr. Andrew Walsh, who will be joining us online. Mr. Andrew Walsh is the Associate Director of the Greenberg Center. He holds degrees from Trinity College, Yale Divinity School, and Harvard University, where he earned a PhD in the history of American civilization in 1996. His academic interests focus on American religious, cultural, and political history during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Walsh also worked for the Hartford Courant for 6 years, serving as a reporter, bureau chief, and religion writer. His doctoral dissertation is entitled "For Our City's Welfare: Building a Protestant Establishment in Late 19th Century Hartford." He was the co-editor of the Center's Religion by Region project, an 8-volume series on religion and public life in the United States, and also of the Future of Religion in America book series published by Columbia University Press. With Mark Silk, he was also the co-author of One Nation Indivisible, Religion and Region in America Today. We will then round off our panel presentations with Father Theodore Stylianopoulos, who will be presenting on Archbishop Demetrius of America. Born in Messenia, Greece, Father Stylianopoulos immigrated with his family to the United States in 1951. He studied at Hellenic College Holy Cross, Boston University School of Theology, and Harvard Divinity School, where he obtained his doctorate in New Testament. He taught New Testament and courses on Orthodox spirituality at Hellenic College and Holy Cross from 1967 to 2009. He retired as Archbishop Iakovos Professor of Orthodox Theology and Professor in New Testament, and he is the Emeritus Professor as such. His latest books are The Making of the New Testament, which was published in 2014, and The Apostolic Gospel in 2015. He and Presbytera Fay enjoy living in Boston, Jamaica Plain, and near their 4 children and 7 grandchildren and many dear friends. So I present to you our panelists for this afternoon, and I would like to invite Dr. Skedros to commence our panel.
Thank you, Father Bartholomew. Archbishop Alexander is sort of an enigmatic figure. We've spoken so much about him this morning in our first session, dealing with the early history of the Archdiocese. And allow me to just provide a couple of general observations with a bit brief bio. But I'll start with an 3 evaluations of him from 1930 onwards. Father George Papaioannou, in his sort of magisterial work on the history of Hellenism in America, writes about Archbishop Alexander, and he's writing towards about the end of Alexander's position here in America, which ended in 1930. He says, quote, "A physically and emotionally demolished, but amazingly stubborn churchman. The Church of Greece Subsequently, after 1930, actually a little bit prior to 1930, in several publications, especially after the 1921 reappointment of Theoklitos back in Athens as Metropolitan or Archbishop of Athens, and the removal of Alexander as the Synodikos Epitropos of America, called Archbishop Alexander's activities as, quote, a revolution of Alexander of Rodostolu. And finally, Yeromenos Troianos, who is the bishop who the Patriarchate and the Church of Greece, in conjunction with the state of Greece, sent to America in 1930 to try to resolve the issues at the Archdiocese, in his report of 1930 states, quote, a shallow, uncanonical, unpatriotic, and revolutionary hierarch with a limited conscience. Ouch. So who is this Bishop Alexander, or Archbishop Alexander? He was born in 1874 in Nicomedia, entered Halki in 1892, born in 1874, entered Halki in 1892, ordained a deacon in 1895, graduated from Halki in 1902. So far, sounding pretty traditional of someone in that period and in that location who was interested in a life in the church. He's ordained a priest, and he was appointed as a chancellor of the Cordelius, which was a chancellor of Cordelius in the eparchy of Ephesus under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Nothing too earth-shattering there. In 1907, he was elected an auxiliary bishop under the Metropolitan of Adrianople, and he was given the title of the Diocese of Rodostolu, and that stuck with him. And so that will be his title, Bishop of Rodostolu, when he will come to America in 1918 with Metropolitan Meletios Metaxakis. In 1910, he is assigned to the Metropolitan of Xanthi, and then also he's assigned to the metropolis of Xanthi, and as I mentioned earlier this morning, he also is assigned to the metropolis of Thessaloniki. He is eventually back in Constantinople in 1915, but in 1917 he ends up in Athens. And I do not know enough about his biographical trajectory here to explain his move to Athens in 1917, whether or not he is asked to come to Athens, but his appointment there or his showing up in Athens is providential because he will become a close associate of Meletios Metaxakis, who is then Archbishop of Athens, and he will be one of the 6 individuals that will form the visiting committee in 1918 with Meletios at the head of that visiting committee to come to America. And it's at that point, as Meletios returns to Athens, that he appoints Alexander as the synodical trustee, if you want to translate synodikos epitropos, if you want to translate it that way. He remains in that position, as we've heard a lot about earlier this morning, until the Archdiocese is elevated is recognized and comes under the Patriarchate of Constantinople and is elevated to an Archdiocese in 1922. However, back to Salt Lake City. I brought up Salt Lake City only because I've done a lot of archival work for Salt Lake City, but the quote here is indicative of his early years. So in 1918 to 1921, before everything sort of blows up, 1920, 1921, he's touring America, and he's touring Greek-American communities. And he visits Salt Lake City. And in the Salt Lake Tribune of the 14th of November, 1919, the title of the article says, Greek bishop is coming soon, Orthodox Church prelate expects to pay a visit to Salt Lake. In the article, he is quoted as saying, quote, and these are a quote attributed to Alexander, my special mission in America is to organize our church. The Greek Orthodox Church is going toward a bright future with the overthrow of Turkish rule in Asia Minor. The church will no longer suffer oppression and the murder of its sons and daughters. We have always dreamed of once again conducting Mass in the great Cathedral of St. Sophia at Constantinople. which has been a Muslim mosque since the day the Turks captured Constantinople, and interrupting the Mass put the worshipers to the sword. The patriarch of our church, he continues, attended the peace conference at Paris, and we understand that St. Sophia will be returned to us. We will finish the Mass, which was interrupted by the Turks, after which the crescent will be taken from the dome and replaced by the cross. Now, I share that quote with you only because it doesn't necessarily reflect his ministry in some sense, and that's not what we're sort of looking at, but it also reminds us of the context in which he sees his role in America. It's a much larger, much broader context. And that's what gets picked up by the Salt Lake newspaper. Now, I don't have any evidence about his visit to Salt Lake. This says that he was coming, and what he said in Salt Lake, I have not been able to find anything about that. Now, as I think about his contributions, and I'll sum this up, I don't want to spend too much time here, but as I think about his contributions, perhaps the most controversial contribution, and it's really not his fault, but he's the bishop involved in this. And for some people looking back at the early establishment of the Archdiocese in 1922, a bright moment in the history of the Archdiocese, even though he may not be perceived as a bright leader, is the establishment of the Synod of Bishops. The way the charter of 1922 read, it read that he would be appointed, and he was already appointed as Archbishop by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarchate of Constantinople establishes this Synod of Bishops that will consist of 4 bishops: the Archbishop, a Bishop of Chicago, San Francisco, and Boston. Immediately after the Archdiocese is established, after he's appointed as Archbishop, in July of 1923, June of 1923, there are 2 elections that take place. And the elections take place in Chicago. Actually, they take place in Chicago. The ordination takes place in one Sunday in Chicago and the other Sunday in Boston. But what's interesting about the election, and it's recorded here, I don't have the exact quote, but I'm taking this from Simonides, who had printed this in the Orthodox Observer in 2013. He says, quote, "The ecclesiastical assembly that elected these 2 bishops met on April 18th, 1923 at St. Constantine and Helen Parish in Chicago. Pay attention. The 31 clergy and 21 lay representatives in attendance voted by secret ballot." 21 lay people voted. And the results were forwarded to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Archimandrites Philaretos, Ioannidis, and Joachim Alexopoulos received the most votes. Archbishop Alexander, in a letter dated May 8, informed the faithful that the Holy Synod of Constantinople elected Philaretos of Chicago. Close quote. The point here is that the Archdiocese in 1923 had a fully fledged, some people use semi-autonomous Synod of Bishops that had a leader, a chairman of the Synod, and 3 bishops. What's interesting about the 1922 charter, and it does not get changed until 1931, is that they were all appointed for life. That all 4 bishops were appointed for life. And that's why when in 1930, when Damaskinos comes to resolve the issues in the Archdiocese, he literally has to get the agreement of all 4 bishops to resign. Literally has to get them to agree to resign. With the one exception of San Francisco was not asked to resign, and I think it's sort of that my New York theory: the further away you are from New York, the better off you are. And so being out in San Francisco with so few of parishes, I don't think he was a threat. And so they figured, just leave him alone out in San Francisco, but let's get rid of Chicago, let's get rid of Boston, and we will recreate the Archdiocese in 1931. Challenges, contribution, legacy. Challenges for Alexander were really to find out who are those clergy that are serving in the parishes that now he is supposed to be over. How well are they trained? Another challenge that he had, and we mentioned earlier this morning, was there were multiple Greek Orthodox hierarchs active in America who were ordaining, or at least having priests under them, and to deal with that sort of multiplicity of clergy and not having a clear hierarchical structure in place was a real problem. And then I would say the other challenge he had was the relationship with the Greek press. By 1927, both the Atlantis and the Ethnikos Kyrios, both of which were politically very separate, they had united in their anti-Alexander approach. And they had basically said, we don't like Alexander, he's the problem, let's move him on. And I think the understanding of Alexander as being sort of hard-headed actually proves true. He stuck it out until he was literally forced to resign. Contribution. I would say 3 contributions. He tried the best he could to get a handle on the extent of the Archdiocese and how to run it. He did put things in motion, maybe not any organizational structure per se, but somebody had to at least begin to get things organized. He tried to deal with uncanonical clergy, and then I would also say a legacy of his, or a contribution, was that he did provide an example of perhaps what a semi-autonomous synodal structure in America might look like. Legacy. Unfortunately, perhaps the legacy is, one of his legacies is that he survived as best he could perhaps one of the most intense moments of political division among Greek Orthodox parishes in America. I would also say part of his legacy was that he was not a quitter, and he fought till the end. And then finally, I would add that perhaps if he had been more successful, maybe it was his personality, maybe he couldn't have pulled this off, but perhaps if he had been successful, one wonders what the Archdiocese would have looked like post-1930 without a new charter of 1931. It's an interesting question to think about. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Now, at this time, we're going to ask for clarifying questions only. If they are more substantive, we will save that for the discussion portion. Clarifying question?
Jim, was he responsible for the purchase of the property of the Archdiocese in Astoria?
So it is purchased. It's under him. Yeah, it's under him. And in fact, it is. I forget the exact address, but that is also the location of the school for Saint Athanasios. It becomes the location for the Saint Athanasios as well. And in fact, the synod in the minutes of the synod between 23 and 30. Several of those meetings were held there at the chapel. They say the chapel of St. Athanasius there, or the chapel there in the Archdiocese headquarters. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Skedros. At this time, Matthew Nemi will be presenting on Archbishop Athinagoras.
So I have 10 minutes to talk about maybe the most gigantic figure in 20th century Orthodoxy, and specifically about his time in America, but even talking about his time in America in 10 minutes would be ridiculous. I'd just be running through a list of facts. So rather than repeat things that have probably been written or talked about elsewhere, I thought I'd focus on one particularly distinctive aspect of Athenagoras' tenure in America, which is his relationship with the United States government and this idea that he had in his mind of America and how the role he wanted to play. Because I think this actually undergirds a lot of what he did as Archbishop and also a lot of what he would later do as Patriarch. So one of the most important things you can understand about then Archbishop Athenagoras is that he absolutely loved America, the mythos of America, what in his view America stood for. He believed in a divinely appointed, almost messianic destiny for the United States. In 1951, when he was Ecumenical Patriarch, he had a meeting with the U.S. consul in Istanbul, and here's how the consul described what Athenagoras said. As usual, he talked at some length of his belief that the United States must remain in the Near East for several centuries to fulfill the mission which had been given to it by God to give freedom, prosperity, and happiness to all people. Centuries, he said. In March 1942, so going back to when he was Archbishop, he met with an agent of the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. And Athenagoras told the agent, I have 3 bishops, 300 priests, and a large and far-flung organization. Everyone under my order is under yours. You may command them for any service you require. there will be no questions asked, and your directions will be executed faithfully. So this was all in the context of his deep concern that the Allies be victorious in World War II. And he wanted to do whatever he could. A month later, he was 56 years old. He attempted to enlist in the U.S. Army. He was turned down. I have his draft card. It's an amazing thing. He continued to work closely with the OSS. One of his tasks that he undertook was to identify eligible Greek Americans to serve in the military. And under orders from Athenagoras, the bishops and priests of the Greek Archdiocese collected something like 100,000 names in short order, which astonished the OSS. This caught the attention of William Donovan, who was the head of the OSS, who began direct communications with the Archbishop. And in May of 1942, Athenagoras wrote to Donovan, "I think I don't do very much for the U.S., to whom I am deeply indebted. I am ready, though, to submit myself to any duty and to make every possible sacrifice for our beloved country, which is fighting for universal freedom and justice and for the new day which is to come." In 1943, so the following year, he announced plans for an English-speaking seminary in America, a Pan-Orthodox seminary. This is different than this institution. He wanted an English-speaking seminary, but the primary motivation behind this seminary was more political than pastoral, and it was aimed at training priests to serve in Europe, not in the United States. Here's how Athenagoras himself described the plan at the time. "When priests trained at the seminary return to their countries, they will help further goodwill and understanding between the Church in America and the Orthodox Church in Europe. Generally speaking, Americans interested in post-war problems do not realize that the Orthodox churches in Russia, Syria, Greece, and other countries will have a great influence in rehabilitation efforts after the war. Our purpose is not only to train future priests in democratic precepts, but to convince them that real democracy consists of much more than mere lip service." In the end, the seminary idea never came to fruition, but it shows Athenagoras' creative approach to leveraging his role as archbishop for the benefit of American political ideals. As World War II gave way to the Cold War, the ecumenical throne changed hands. The elderly Patriarch Benjamin died, and his right-hand man, Maximus of Chalcedon, was elected patriarch. Maximus was viewed by many as the wrong man at the wrong time. He was seen as too weak in the face of an ascendant Soviet-backed Moscow Patriarchate, and it was widely reported that he was mentally unstable. Meanwhile, Archbishop Athenagoras' bond with America grew ever closer. On January 28, 1947, Athenagoras had a private off-the-record meeting with President Harry Truman and a few key Greek officials. 3 weeks later, Athenagoras gave Truman a piece of the True Cross, and this led to the famous photo of Athenagoras kissing the president's head that everybody's probably seen. A month after that, oh, by the way, that True Cross, if you want to go to see the piece of the True Cross, it's in Missouri at the Truman Library. So there's a piece of the True Cross in Missouri. A month after that, Truman addressed Congress and formally articulated for the first time what became known as the Truman Doctrine. What was stated at the time was the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. That all is a fairly well-known fact, but what's often forgotten is that the immediate cause of Truman's speech and the immediate cause of the Truman Doctrine was news that the British would stop providing aid to the Greek government, which was embroiled in a civil war against the Greek Communist Party. The British had also been aiding Turkey, and in his speech, Truman asked Congress to provide aid to the Turks as well. Altogether, he asked Congress to approve $400 million in aid to Greek and Turkish governments and to authorize sending U.S. military personnel and equipment to the region. The Truman Doctrine, then, was originally conceived in the context of Greece and Turkey, and Athenagoras was sort of right there as this was being developed. Then in May, fresh off the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, the New York Times reported that Patriarch Maximus was having an acute nervous breakdown, and Archbishop Athenagoras was named as the leading candidate to succeed him. The interest of U.S. intelligence officials in the matter did not go unnoticed by the New York Times, which wrote, "No official support of Archbishop Athenagoras has been expressed by the Americans, although United States military intelligence is watching the race." The Times added, "The Turks call the Archbishop Turkey's unofficial ambassador to the United States, so cordial are his relations with the Turkish government. The Greek government is favorable to Archbishop Athenagoras, but is reluctant to have such an efficient emissary leave the United States and its wealthy contributors to Greek causes." Athenagoras, then, was the perfect solution to the patriarchal problem. He was favored by the United States and Turkey and Greece. Patriarch Maximus finally resigned in October 1948 after an extremely difficult 32-month tenure as patriarch. And General George Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, personally lobbied for Athenagoras to become the next ecumenical patriarch. The powerful Greek-American businessman Spiros Skouras, whom Marshall consulted during this process, later wrote, "General Marshall, in his capacity as Secretary of State, had no hesitation in sponsoring His Holiness, and thanks mainly to his efforts and influence, the Holy Synod decided to elect Archbishop Athenagoras as Patriarch, and the Turkish government agreed to his election." After his election, but before leaving the United States, Athenagoras met with President Truman, and it's perhaps at this meeting that Truman offered to let Athenagoras fly to Istanbul on an airplane provided by the U.S. government. It's been widely reported that this was actually the presidential plane, which had the awkward name, the Sacred Cow. Other reports are that the plane was just a U.S. military plane, not a presidential one. Either way, the message was clear. Athenagoras and America were aligned. There's a little-known fact. I didn't write this down, but right before he left, he got dirt from the Rose Garden at the White House, and he brought it with him to Turkey, and then he put it at the feet of a statue of Ataturk when he arrived. So this strategic alliance was forged during Athenagoras' years as Archbishop of North and South America. But for Athenagoras, at least, the relationship was far more than strategic. His love for America was deep, even passionate. In 1953, so when he was Patriarch of Constantinople, the U.S. consul in Istanbul wrote of a visit to Athenagoras, and I'll quote him, "The Patriarch spent much of his time in expressing his love and admiration for the United States and all things our country represents. He went so far as to state that the cornerstone of the policy which he had set for himself as patriarch was to advance American ideals. His expressions of admiration for the United States were at times so unrestrained as to become almost embarrassing." So to give you like a little insight into the personality and the character and the mindset of Athenagoras, that's what I got.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Are there any clarifying questions for Matthew prior to moving on to later to a substantive?
Is there any evidence that he felt betrayed by the United States as the decades kind of proceeded, and obviously the United States favoring Turkey over Greece?
He never expressed any indication of that. At the end of his life, kind of he's in his 80s, he knew his time was running short. He reached back out to Spiros Skouras and attempted to get at that point it was the Nixon administration involved in the succession process. And at that point, the American government was not interested at all. And Kissinger said, "We don't want anything to do with this." And so, if he felt betrayal, he never expressed it in any place I've ever found. Although I think it would be justifiable for him to feel that way.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We will now be moving on to Father Makarios Niakaros' presentation on Archbishop Michael. And then after Father's presentation, we're going to do just a brief break to ask some questions before moving on to our next two panelists, only because for practical reasons it works a little bit better, especially since we have to have Mr. Andrew Walsh online. So, Father?
Good afternoon. I myself found it very difficult to condense in 10 or 15 minutes the ministry of Archbishop Michael of America. But I'm going to offer just a brief biography some major accomplishments, contributions during his time here as Archbishop, and the challenges that he faced as he was when he came to America, and the legacy that he left when he passed in July of 1958. His Eminence Archbishop Michael of North and South America was born Thukydides Konstantinidis in the town of Maronia of Komotini in Thrace, Greece, on May 27, 1982. From his parents, he received a devout upbringing and received his encyclical learning in the elementary school of his birthplace. In 1907, he matriculated in the Theological School of Halki, where he graduated with honors in 1914. In 1914, he was also ordained a deacon by his spiritual father, the Metropolitan of Seleukia, who was the Scholarchi of Halki back then, Germanos Styrinopoulos. He continued with his studies with a scholarship from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, going first to the Theological Academy of St. Petersburg, and because of the political developments that were taking place in Russia, he was an eyewitness to the communist revolution. He finish his theological studies at the Academy of Kiev, and he had to, for a certain amount of time, find refuge in the city of Rostov. He was ordained a presbyter and elevated to the rank of Archimandrite of the Ecumenical Throne in 1919 when he returned to Constantinople by Metropolitan Kalinikos of Derkon. In 1920, he served as Patriarchal Exarch to the Holy Metropolis of Maronia and served as a vicar there for 3 years. In 1923, he was assigned as Archbishop of the Archdiocese, as Secretary of the Archdiocese of Athens, and later as Grand Chancellor by Archbishop Chrysostomos Papadopoulos. And because of the time, I guess even back then there were church politics going on, Chrysostomos Papadopoulos wanted to ordain him an auxiliary bishop, and the metropolitans, the members of the synod, denied or did not want, in order to embitter Archbishop Chrysostomos, they ordained an archimandrite, Anthimos Tsatsos, who was not as educated and dynamic as Michael was. In 1927, he was assigned as the presiding priest of the Greek Orthodox Cathedral of St. Sophia in London, England, where he took a great part in the ecumenical dialogue back then, and was very much offered a lot of knowledge, a lot of help to the Greek Orthodox community of London. He published a publication about the history of the Greeks in London as well. In September of 1939, he was elected an ordained Metropolitan of Corinth by Archbishop Chrysanthos of Athens, where he served for a decade under very difficult conditions because of World War II and the German Nazi occupation of Greece. He was very much involved in the trials and tribulations of his people. He, at the time, freed 100 or so prisoners that were being ready for execution, and because Michael knew German fluently and he knew many languages, some being, besides speaking English fluently, he spoke fluent Turkish, Russian, French, German, Italian, Arabic, and Spanish. So he really was a well-learned man, and he was able to communicate with the commander, of the German army, and he was able to obtain their release. The death of Timothy of Rhodes created a sad circumstance. However, it proved the way for the election of Michael, and he was elected on October of 1949 and enthroned at the Archdiocesan Cathedral December 15th, 1949. And he was unanimously elected Archbishop of North and South America, where he shepherded for more than 8 years with love and concern the Greek Orthodox people of the Holy Archdiocese in America. And Athenagoras, immediately upon his election, described him as a man of devotion who loved God, whose faith was fervent, and his love unquenchable, a modest hierarch, well-disciplined in the sacred things, being adorned with a broad education and experience, well-experienced in ecclesiastical matters. When he was elected Archbishop of America and came to this country, the press was the American press was very favorable of his election and wrote a wonderful article. And this was because Archbishop Michael was really a anti-communist. And he was an anti-communist, and he said communism is anti-Christian, and it is an illness of society. Not that he identified with any political ideology, but he believed very strongly that man, being made in the image and likeness of God, should be free and have a free will, and to exercise what he chooses to do. So I just wanted to mention a few of the accomplishments of Michael during his tenure here. His problematic mission was founded on two foundations, Orthodox Christianity and Hellenism. He emphasized upon his enthronement as Archbishop that his goal will be to proclaim and live the Orthodox Christian faith, preserve and promote the ideals of Hellenism, and continue to strengthen the bonds of cooperation with the Mother Church, the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He acknowledged from the very start that he will try to be a worthy leader of an archdiocese with some 800 faithful, which was widespread over a vast continent. So his first concern was to familiarize himself with the people of his eparchy, that is, the parishes, their needs, and their problems. In the first year, Archbishop Michael, in 1950, visited 107 communities. And if we think back then, the airports not being as numerous as they are today, and the means of travel, he really was a tireless man trying to reach all of the communities and trying to really get to know his people. So it was for this reason that he, even though the Archdiocese had the districts, that he appointed to each archdiocesan district, he created the ordained auxiliary bishops, of course with the blessing and the approval of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And he proceeded to ordain these men who were, specifically he ordained Athinagoras Kokinakis as titular Bishop of Elias in the 4th District of San Francisco, Ezekiel Tsoukalas, Mark Lipa for the Albanian-speaking people, and Bishop Irenaeus was ordained as Bishop of Abydos for South America, and Bishop Demetrius Makris. So he really was instrumental in keeping the archdiocesan districts very active and allowing the bishops to really serve the needs of the people. And of course, he would oversee what was being done in those districts. Michael reorganized the archdiocese by strengthening an existing departments and specifically establishing new departments that would address exclusively the concerns of catechetical and Greek education, youth ministry. And here we can say that Michael was worked tirelessly in order to establish the GOA, of course the Greek Orthodox Youth of America, and even an Office of Public Relations to deal with the American government and also the Greek government. It is important to note that Michael was so organized in the operations of the Archdiocese that some of his commentators said that the offices of the Archdiocese resembled those of a governmental ministry. He visited 375 parishes during his tenure of almost 9 years as Archbishop of America. He founded, with the corporation of the parishes, of course, 9 daily parochial schools, 350 afternoon schools, and 375 catechetical schools. Michael had stated from the very beginning, of course, that he saw the Archdiocese of America as a missionary archdiocese. Archbishop Michael also wanted to communicate very much with his people. He improved and cultivated the Orthodox Observer, and that's why he had it transferred from St. Michael's to the Archdiocese where he was, and he was able to oversee it. He also, because he was a great theologian and an intellectual, himself created the Greek Orthodox Theological Review, where he himself was president of the editorial staff, and where the theological articles in great depth were published. Michael was also aware of the spiritual needs of those who spoke very little or no Greek, and he needed to address that concern. He therefore decided that English could be used during the sermons and during the teaching of the Sunday schools. He also was instrumental in the publication of a bilingual divine liturgy pamphlet to be used in all parishes. One of his first acts was also to visit Holy Cross and to visit St. Basil's Academy, and he strengthened the studies there and instituted a new program of studies that gained recognition by the local state authorities. Michael also took a great interest in social welfare, which is why he continually encouraged all parishes to establish Philoptochos chapters and hold successful fund drives in order to assist those in need and also aid those suffering from natural disasters, not only here in America, but also in Greece. And we know he was very much instrumental in establishing the Home for the Aged in Yonkers, New York. Michael realized that under his growing archdiocese, due to the immigration that was happening at the time, that the multifaceted activities could not be successful without the corresponding organization of a strong economic program. And one of perhaps his greatest achievements was the institution of the Decadolarion from the Monodolarion, which was passed in 1950 at the 10th Clergy Lady Congress in St. Louis, Missouri. And there the Archbishop sat through a 5-hour debate about whether it should go from the Monodolarion to the Decadolarion, and Archbishop Michael stood up and emphasized that, it was a sacred mission, o skopos itan hieros, and he was able to have that passed. Michael also saw as one of his roles as Archbishop of America was on a national level, and he was making aware and defending some of the issues that the Homogenia was facing. He therefore took a great interest in the struggles of a number of issues, but the 4 key issues for Michael was the abduction of the Greek youth during the communists behind the Iron Curtain, children from Greece that were abducted and taken to the communist countries of Czechoslovakia and other countries, the Cyprus issue and the imprisonment of Makarios, the question of northern Epirus, and the violent acts of the Turks against the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek community in Constantinople. So Michael was a man who really was tireless in whatever he did. We know that he worked until he could no longer physically work, of course, at the Clergy Lady Congress in Salt Lake City on July 13th, 1958. He died, but he was taken to the hospital where he was operated, and unfortunately, the Lord took him. I would say that one of the challenges, the major challenge for Michael, and of course we have to remember that Athenagoras did a wonderful job of uniting the Greeks of the Archdiocese. There were no political divisions. There was some problem when he was elected as Archbishop of America with the Patriarchate of Alexandria, meaning the Greek-speaking people coming from Egypt were coming to America and having parishes that were under the Patriarchate of Alexandria, but that was not a major issue. Michael's concern was, and that is why I find it very, very difficult to speak about him in such a short time, was, and really the title of the dissertation that I completed in 2017, his contribution to the Church, to theology, and to the dialogue with the contemporary world. Michael's concern was how do we convey the message of orthodoxy to the American public, to the contemporary man. His, of course, love was that of St. Paul, and Michael felt that as St. Paul converted and had a conversion experience, he called theologically all of the people, his flock, to have a spiritual conversion. And I just wanted to read something that can be seen as the challenge that he faced and also his legacy. Michael, not only as Archbishop, but at every stage of his ecclesiastical career, meaning Metropolitan of Corinth and when he was in London, was confronted and challenged by new provocations which forced him to adapt the Church's word of salvation to the occasional new conditions he encountered. In this attempt to evaluate this adaptation of his theological word to the contemporary world, we confirmed in the dissertation here, with considerable surprise, the rapidity and the decisiveness with which he would recognize the needs and the problems of each of his flocks, not only in America but elsewhere, as well as his steadfastness in the faith of the Church, as well as his choice to draw the answers that were plaguing humanity out of the long-age patristic spiritual tradition and the sacred scripture. So I would say that Michael, and we can say that he did many things as Archbishop, meaning in an administrative sense. But my greatest joy and treasure from doing a study on Archbishop Michael was that he was indeed a spiritual giant. And he fell between two great spiritual giants, Archbishop Athenagoras and Archbishop Michael. Some people consider him a forgotten archbishop because he only did a short period of time. But if reading his works and what he has done as archbishop, indeed, in my mind, Archbishop Michael was one of the spiritual giants of our archdiocese.
At this time, we're going to be accepting questions for the first three panelists, and then thereafter move on to Dr. Walsh and then Father Stylianopoulos' presentations. Do you have any questions for either Dr. Skedros, Mr. Nemi, and or Father Makarios?
Dr. Skedros, on the question of the newspaper opposition to Archbishop Alexander, those opposing newspapers, what were the reasons? Were they personal, institutional, ethnic, linguistic, financial, or what? Can you tell us?
Thank you. So not having really investigated in much depth, I'm going to give you a guess. My guess is that it was more part of his character and his inability to resolve the tensions that are certainly around by 1927, not only between the Konvopoulos group in Lowell, Massachusetts, but also the royalists, Venizelist splits within the communities, and I think also his personality of being difficult to get along with. That's my guess. Alex, do you have a thought on that?
I would add. Thank you. I would add that the general editor of the Ethnikos Kyrikas was Kallimachos, who signed the charter in 1921, the establishment. And, I think Kallimachos spends his time in the National Herald wanting to be Archbishop himself, if I can. It may be a pattern with the National Herald, I don't know. So I think Kallimachos was really set against Alexandros. The interesting thing is, just as how they allied themselves against Alexandros, the way that they allied themselves behind Athenagoras is almost amazing. And I think it's the Greek ambassador Simopoulos who's herding in the Greek cats and making people say, look, this is our only chance, otherwise the Archdiocese is going to be in trouble.
There's a question from Father Vrame.
This would be for all three of you. All of them had to deal with the other Orthodox jurisdictions' presences in the U.S. during their ministries. How did they approach the others? Specifically, I know Athenagoras created the Federation, but even Alexander knows they're here. Michael knows they're here. How do you see that element of a common challenge that they faced?
I'll just speak really quickly. Looking at a couple of documents that are in Manolis's book, Alexander writes a couple of letters to the other Alexander, who's Archbishop of the Russian Archdiocese here in America. I think it's the 1925, 26, something like that. And there was a real dispute about who's the bishop. Is it Efthymios?
Yeah, he was a French guy.
But Efthymios ordained a Greek, and then that Greek gentleman was now serving as a priest. And Alexander finds out about it and writes a pretty stern letter to the other Alexander of the Russian diocese saying, you can't do that. And they both, it's interesting, in that letter, he opens up by saying, I don't want to get involved in your stuff. Don't get involved in my stuff. But then Alexander of the Russian Church writes back and says at the opening of the letter, I don't want to get involved in your jurisdiction, and I'm sorry that this happened. From my understanding, we had the okay from you guys to do this, but I don't want to do anything that will step on your toes. That's the extent that I can speak to at that. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd say about Alexander's tenure was it was just utter chaos in every jurisdiction. There were like multiple Russian jurisdictions, multiple Antiochian jurisdictions, even down to like the smaller jurisdictions were internal battles. So it wasn't really a great decade for Pan-Orthodox interaction. By the time you get to Athenagoras, there's definitely, especially in his kind of the latter half of his tenure, as you mentioned, Father Tony, the whole idea of the Federation, which was kind of the original Pan-Orthodox, the proto-SCOBA. Before there was an Assembly of Bishops, before there was SCOBA, you had the Federation, and it was the heads of all of the different jurisdictions in America, for the most part. There were a couple of them that got left out, coming together and coordinating. They coordinated. They wanted to get. They were trying to get Orthodox clergy exempt from the draft. Was one of the big pushes that was being made because this was during World War II. So he was behind that. There's a big moment. I think there's some stuff downstairs on the displays of him with the Athenagoras and the other bishops with the mayor or the governor of New York, Dewey, signing this legislation that in some cases still governs, still like the kind of foundation documents for some of our jurisdictions. Like the Antiochians still rely on this ancient New York legislation for their incorporation status. And so this was kind of a proto-SCOBA. So he was very much behind that, got them together for statements about the war, that kind of thing. It wasn't anti kind of Pan-Orthodoxy, but at the same time, everybody was kind of dealing with their own stuff. You want to say anything about Archbishop?
Yeah, I think Archbishop Michael had good relations with other Orthodox hierarchs. Of course, he very much believed that as a hierarch and as Archbishop who was appointed here by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, he believed that he had a leading role in talking and discussing with the other archbishops. Even when he was in England, he participated in the ecumenical dialogue with the Anglicans, and he really was trying to, as here in America, picturing having the voice with having the church with one voice instead of many voices. I think Orthodox unity back then was not so much discussed as we would discuss it today, but I think that Michael did not want people to see, the American public to view Orthodox churches, whether they were Greek Archdiocese or Antiochians or Russians, as different faiths. So his participation in England wasn't really to listen to what other people believed as Anglicans and Lutherans and so forth, but he saw that as an opportunity to preach and to promote the truth, the fullness of truth in Orthodoxy.
We had a question also from Father Patrick Vescuso.
Yeah, I had actually a question for Father Nicodemus. Would you say that there is sometimes would you say that there is sometimes some confusion, with all respect to Archbishop Iakovos, that there is some confusion between the accomplishments of Archbishop Michael and Archbishop Iakovos?
I would say that every archbishop offered whatever he was able to. As I said, when I started this study and dissertation.
For example,
Yeah.
the GOA, for
Yes.
example. Some of the programs. Growing up, I anecdotally always associated these with the accomplishments of His Eminence Archbishop Iakovos. But later, just through reading, I find that many of these efforts began under Michael.
Well, many people, again, believe even today that knew no other archbishop other than Iakovos, thought that Iakovos was the one who had ties with the American government. And of course, that started under Athenagoras with Truman. But Michael had a very close friendship with Dwight Eisenhower. He was the first Orthodox Archbishop, Hierarch, to give a prayer at the inauguration of Eisenhower. And he had Eisenhower participate in the consecration of St. Sophia Cathedral, putting the cornerstone. So I think that Archbishop Michael, on January the 18th, 1950, and I remember specifically, he went to visit, was received by Harry Truman, and he brought up the issues that I spoke of, the abduction of the Greek children, the Greek youth taken to communist lands, the Cyprus issue, the northern Epirus, and the Patriarchate, because of course in the 1950s we had the, after 1955, the Septembriana. So I think that I believe that what got me started on Michael was I grew up also hearing about Iakovos and Athenagoras. And I said, well, wait a minute, there was an 8-year void, an 8-year gap, 9 years. Who was Archbishop back then?
Not a void.
You know, I mean, was not aware, I should say. And by his works, he wrote extensively. He was an intellectual, very much, even his sermons and his encyclicals. When I read them, I think I'm reading, you know, Basil, Chrysostom. He was.
Just really quickly, so it's pretty clear that with the appointment of Alexander and especially with the appointment of Athenagoras, the Greek government's involved, the Greek government. So either through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, et cetera, or an ambassador in New York. Do we know whether the Greek government is involved in Michael's appointment? And it could be behind the scenes. Have you had any opportunity to see any documents?
What prepared Michael for coming to America was the very fact that he chose, instead of fighting or instead of disappointing Archbishop Chrysostomos Papadopoulos, because he was appointed by Chrysostomos Papadopoulos as Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Athens, Secretary, and then Chancellor, where he did a lot of educational work with the priests in the Archdiocese of Athens. But he was, had Timothy not passed and been taken by the Lord, Michael would not have been elected, probably. Michael, and I think it was divine providence that Michael left the Archdiocese of Athens after the election of Anthimos Tsatsos, who was less educated, less charismatic, less of a worker than Michael in the Archdiocese in Athens. And they did that just to embitter Chrysostomos Papadopoulos, the Metropolitans. And as I said, there's politics always going on. Instead of Michael staying and saying, trying to be elected, or Chrysostomos again fighting or trying to push to have him elected an auxiliary bishop, Germanos Strinopoulos, who became Archbishop of Thyatira, he was first Metropolitan of Seleucia and Scholarchi of Halki, he invited Michael to come to London. Had Michael not gone to London, I don't think his election as Archbishop would have happened, because there he learned not only English, but he learned many things from the way the Anglican Church functioned in society. Priests going to the hospitals, going to the homes of people, going to the businesses. Michael was very much impressed by that. So these are things that prepared him for the Archdiocese of America, and also his service in Corinth. He was selling his engolpia, stavrous, to strengthen the syssitia that were the food pantries, and it was a very, very difficult time in Corinth from 1939 when was 1940 to 1949. So he really saw the pain of the people, but he participated in that pain. He himself was serving the people and giving monies and supporting them ethically.
Thank you very much for your presentations. We're going to move on now with the presentation of, oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I was going to say about Archbishop Michael that we pass him over in so many instances. Father mentioned the founding of GOA, but another very important footnote in the history of this school and the Archdiocese is that Michael prompted and worked hard for the academic recognition of this school from the authorities in Massachusetts first and later. So he also worked for bringing, raising the level of education at the school, which of course included the necessity for being recognized and accreditation. And we, under his tenure as Archbishop, the school first granted accredited degrees, the Bachelor of Arts in Theology in 1955-56.
Thank you very much for your contribution. At this point, we'll move on with the two final presentations, first by Mr. Andrew Walsh, who will be speaking on Archbishop Spiridon. Or Dr. Walsh, are you prepared? Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I'm ready to go. Do you see me?
Wonderful,
Yeah,
wonderful. Feel free to begin your presentation.
Okay, well, I apologize for imposing this on you, but I retired on Friday, and the college just cut off a lot of my office communications. So it's a difficult day. For years, in the late 1990s, was probably the most turbulent period that the church had encountered since Alexander's time. And there are several background features which explain this. But at the beginning of Spiridon's era, accompanied real policy changes in the patriarchy of Constantinople and its approach to the church in America. And, it goes without you need to understand there's a major effort to roll back or control the independence of the Archdiocese of America in the wake of the long reign of Jacobus, who actually did more to support the patriarchate and guarantee its health than patriarchy could do for itself in a period when it was depopulated very drastically. And, it's worth observing that before Spiridon came to the before he came in 1996, the patriarchy decided to assemble the old Archdiocese in North and South America. And to guarantee that its survival and prosperity and influence in the Orthodox world would be promoted. Patriarch Bartholomew at that point had been on the throne for a few years, but there had been several clear indications that the Church in America
detail, but there's been a lot of ink spilled, especially online, about this kind of stuff. Archbishop Spiridon chose to, in many of his public roles, lead with criticism when he spoke with lay people. And he was, wanting to be a sort of paladin of Hellenism, to express his concern about the de-Greekification of the church in America, without offering a lot of perspective about what it's like to evolve over 100 years as a church in America and what the sort of special circumstances are. But Archbishop Spiridon wasn't comfortable or happy with the tone of Greek life in America, and objected to the sense of laity that they should be consulted, and B, the sense of the clergy that they had to be treated seriously and dealt with sympathetically. So discord reached an advanced point, and the Patriarch, in the beginning of 1999, called the American bishops and Spiridon to Constantinople, where he famously uttered the line, "This man is your archbishop till death." And it appeared then that Bartholomew, who had a similar kind of agenda to strengthen the authority of the church in Constantinople on America and other exarchates, and it appeared at that meeting that the auxiliary bishops, who were, much longer serving in the United States. One of the puzzles about Archbishop Spiridon is that when he opened his mouth, he sounded like a guy from Ohio. But he thought of himself as representing European traditions of authentic hierarchical authority and fidelity to orthodoxy. So he didn't display a lot of diplomacy in dealing with a lot of people. I think he had to, or had the time to. I think he thought the church needed urgent change in a particular direction, and he was determined to do his best for it. So while it looked in January of 1999 that the Patriarchate had moved decisively to back Spiridon, that proved not to be the case. One of the problems evidently was that the Patriarch didn't want a lot of. Hello, there you are. I'm getting battery warnings. Didn't want a lot of division and harshness, but wanted to ratchet up patriarchal supervision of the church in America. And one of the things that Spiridon discovered he'd been sent to America to do was to decrease the archbishop's authority over things, and especially to sort of suddenly not be the Archbishop of North and South America, but be a smaller, more manageable organization from the patriarchal point of view. That happened. He put himself athwart the Patriarch, started complaining himself, and Bartholomew did as he was known to do, dismiss people. And that came as a shock to Spiridon, and it came as a shock to his supporters. And the Patriarchate then spent a few years sort of solidifying its relationship by sending a much more experienced in America person, Demetrius Trachatelis, to the United States. So at the policy level, Spiridon had interesting ideas and wanted to create a kind of popular Orthodox intellectual culture, was much more interested in things like publication and general ideas of marketing the faith. He was a kind of personally, I think the Archbishop who ever used a computer and informed himself about the world that way. And he certainly helped change the faculty profile at Holy Cross. I'm not ready to characterize that as a purge, but Demetrius's first action as Archbishop was to restore the 4 faculty members on the famous disciplinary committee. And I'd say probably the most structurally significant internal thing that resulted as a result of Spiritus's reign is the 2003 charter, now famously revoked, replaced in order and leaving us. And that had there's a real division between an archdiocese run really by one archbishop or a collegial synod. And there are also questions resurfaced about what the structural consultation and consent of the laity is. So, Archbishop Spiritus still lives on the internet. He visits the United States. He was at our Clergy Laity Congress. So he is not here, but not forgotten.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. Are there any clarifying questions for Dr. Walsh before we move on with Father Stylianopoulos' presentation?
These are just questions of fact, right?
Yeah. Father?
Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, distinguished speakers on the panel and in the audience, dear friends. The Archiepiscopal Ministry of Archbishop Demetrius in America was gratefully lengthy, substantive, and inspiring in a true Christ-centered spirit. Let all that you do be done in love, St. Paul says. Archbishop Demetrius did just that throughout his ministry. Gifted with a grace-filled charm, a brilliant mind, and not least the integrity of an honest man. He presented himself everywhere, officially and unofficially, with energizing joy, theological gravity, and spiritual wisdom. The preeminent impact of the Archbishop's ministry was the long period of ecclesial healing, peace, and solidarity in the Archdiocese over virtually his entire tenure. To the charge that the present appreciation of his legacy may be biased, although I hope also realistic and fair, the speaker pleads guilty. What follows are some paragraphs as a descriptive statement of the Archbishop's duties, responsibilities, and cooperation with the various departments of the Archdiocese, institutions and agencies, which are familiar and I will not present. I will only mention that in scope and duration, his ministry is comparable to that of Archbishop Iakovos, given the fact that he began to serve the Church in 1965 from his Harvard days as priest and homilist in local parishes of New England, then 10 years as professor at Hellenic College, Holy Cross, and then, of course, as head of the Church. He also had his moment of historical light in Selma. And in addition, of course, 9/11, ground zero, his presence and his prayers there. So I move on to a section of soft critique. Only history can, of course, disclose the lasting impact of Archbishop Demetrius' legacy. The following observations present only initial considerations for prayerful reflection, framed in reference to the three goals the Archbishop had carefully defined and announced in his enthronement address of September 19, 1999. The goal of vibrant Orthodox faith, the goal of love and philanthropy, and the goal of strong unity in the Church and the wider community. The first goal of a vibrant Orthodox faith, the Archbishop superbly promoted and exemplified by his presence, words, and deeds, and also through his support of the work of the Archdiocese and departments and institutions which foster and advance the Orthodox faith, notably the Hellenic College, the Department of Religious Education, the Crossroad Institute, and some others that he supported. The symbolic highlight of the Archbishop's legacy as a shining witness to the Orthodox faith was his frequent presence and prayers at ground zero, and of course, the planning and raising up of the priceless St. Nicholas Shrine as an abiding radiance of Orthodoxy in America. However, we cannot rest under past laurels and be complacent about present and future prospects. The powerful winds and tides of Western society draw life out of all the Christian churches and from our own Orthodox faithful, who are unavoidably exposed to those winds and tides. As a church, therefore, are we gaining or losing ground? Commentators and surveys have indicated worrisome weakening in the participation pertaining to worship, the sacraments, and parish life. Of course, in this regard, we need thinkers, prophets, and hard workers, and not Cassandras of doom and gloom to meet today's challenges. As an example, I recall the Commission of Spiritual Renewal under Archbishop Iakovos, composed largely of Hellenic College and Holy Cross faculty, which lit a few evangelical fires among the students, priests, and lay people during the 70s and 80s and generated a slew of activities such as conferences, retreats, Bible studies, and publications for both youth and adult education in the church. Today, the cultural changes, the new ideologies, and the social controversies over issues of meaning pertaining to family, marriage, sexuality, gender, and political engagement require far greater efforts. And these issues, which will not go away, cannot be given over to a single commission or department, and then a washing of our hands for the remainder. They must be placed up front and center on the permanent agenda of the highest levels of the church, from the eparchial synod to the archdiocesan council, and so on and so forth. The second goal of Archbishop Demetrius, that of love and philanthropy, the Archbishop fulfilled to a resounding degree through his own example of life and teaching, and through his direct support of the relevant archdiocesan institutions and agencies. His frequent presence and prayers at ground zero are eloquent and symbolic expressions of his love and goodness for all of us at all levels of the Church. I'm not privy to the details, but I grieve to have to say that some persons of high rank or of powerful influence, but very few in comparative numbers and apart from the eparchial synod, chose to follow a different path than the way of love, striking a discordant note in the final years of Archbishop Demetrius' brilliant service to the Church in America. The third goal of Archbishop Demetrius was the promotion of a strong unity in the Church and in the wider community. Unity has two main aspects: unity of hearts and minds, and unity of canonical structures and coherence in administration. For his own part, the Archbishop, in spirit and effort, achieved both of those aspects of unity to a high degree. He frequently expressed devotion to and advanced the canonical bond between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, as is documented in his speeches, news releases, and official actions. Of course, we all know that the status of the metropolis, of all the dioceses, became metropolis, and the bishops became metropolitans. A few issues of concern regarding unity may be noted for prayerful attention. I have 5 such issues, which I will only mention, and if there is time, we can take up any one of them in the discussion period. The first issue of concern is the granting of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. The second issue of concern is the back and forth on another revision of the Archdiocesan Charter, with a recent announcement about that in the newspapers. A third issue of concern is the perennial question of full unity among the Orthodox jurisdictions, and a recent announcement by OCL for immediate declaration of autonomy. A fourth issue of concern pertains to Hellenic College and Holy Cross itself, and specifically certain events in the last 3 to 5 years. A final issue is the issue of St. Nicholas Shrine itself, the debates about it, the work stoppages and so on, of which we are familiar. I come to the concluding paragraphs. In the perspective of 2 of the primary goals of Archbishop Demetrius' ministry, the one of witness to the Orthodox faith and the other of love and philanthropy, these 2 have been fulfilled to a distinguished and widely acknowledged height, particularly by the impact of the Archbishop's own personal example in spirit, words, and deeds. In terms of the third goal, and particularly that of unity in the Church, the overall success in stable administration includes some questions and concerns, as noted above. Formal unity in terms of the canonical bond with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Archdiocese, and in terms of canonical regulations, pertaining to the eparchial synod and all the bodies of the Archdiocese, as well as pertaining to the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the USA, have been clearly defined and strengthened. A future review of the Archdiocese Charter and other future events in world orthodoxy will determine the durability of the above canonical arrangements. The unity of hearts and minds, too, requires prayerful attention. Unity among the faithful and a clear vision of the mission of the Church and her institutions are always relevant and urgent matters for prayer, study, and action in complete transparency. And the front battle line is the local parish, where sources of spiritual power and evangelical mission need to be energized with faith, sincere repentance, and single-minded devotion to Christ and the Holy Spirit. Archbishop Demetrius, in his official announcement of his resignation, I wish to call it retirement, has acknowledged the presence of a few clouds rising on the horizon in the final years of his ministry. He honestly and carefully referred to the, quote, various challenges, unpredictable difficulties, and unjust attacks and actions by various people, end quote. In my view, such unjust attacks and actions by some, few in comparative numbers, and intent to undermine the Archbishop's tenure, constitute a most ungrateful response to his overall brilliant ministry. The Archbishop, for his part, responded with his usual spirit of conciliation. He humbly apologized for any, quote, human mistakes and possible wrong actions, end quote, none of which were the result of any, quote, bad intent, indifference, or selfishness, end quote. He expressed confidence, joy, as well as full comfort with his decision to retire at the time and the way in which he did. I conclude. By the measure of his shining faith, charismatic personality, dedication to the Church, theological output, and splendid response to moments of destiny, such as the event of 9/11, the legacy of Archbishop Demetrius has been blessed by God with deep and memorable impact on orthodoxy in America. I propose that the legacy of Archbishop Demetrius can be justly compared to, and in fact, in some respects regarding theological output, rival the legacy of Archbishop Iakovos, whose own ministry remains indelible in our hearts and minds. The ministries of these two great recent leaders, Archbishop Iakovos and Archbishop Demetrius, may be likened to two powerful wings of the Church, by which, given the historical circumstances and challenges, the Church rose to a distinguished level of her life by the grace of Almighty God. When all is said and done, let us say with St. Paul, so faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Thank you for listening.
Now for the discussion portion, Father Patrick.
Yeah, are we going to be able to get Andrew Walsh back by any chance?
You know, hopefully. Yeah, I noticed that it cut out at some point.
I'll raise the issue. Maybe we can discuss.
Did he click off, or is he going to stay on? His phone died. Okay.
So perhaps we can discuss this just amongst the panelists here then.
Well, there was one thing that I don't think was mentioned, and I'm wondering whether it was something that was critical. There was one thing that was not mentioned, and I'm wondering whether it is critical to understand, having any understanding of His Eminence Archbishop Spiridon, which was the development of the internet. And in particular, at the 1995 represents a watershed year in the development of the internet, with the development of discussion forums, blogs, and other forms of social networking services. And I'm wondering whether in another era, in another age, the tenure of Archbishop Spiridon may have been longer, or may have not been affected at all. I mean, it is rather an ancient and also a new challenge for the Church. I'm reminded of Canon 6 of the Second Ecumenical Council, which deals with safeguarding the reputations of bishops and puts into effect a process for how to handle any charges, any aspersions on a reputation of a bishop. I'm wondering whether this ancient problem also resonates here with Archbishop Spiridon. 10 years later, or less than 10 years later, we also have another phenomena very much supported by the development of the internet, which is the website, the blog of Orthodox Christians for Accountability, which has a tremendous effect in the history, I think, of the OCA and other jurisdictions. So I'm wondering, that's my question about the factor of the internet.
So oddly, I think Father Brame might have insight.
Actually, Andrew has actually written about this and said this is going to be a phenomenon that needs to be looked at, because it's a historic coincidence that this took place. One, Archbishop Spiridon told everybody to get online. As Andrew and I, in a conversation many years ago, said, Archbishop Spiridon at the time, it seemed like a good way for communication to go from the top down. I don't think he anticipated it going from the bottom up. And that created some of the challenges for him, I think, in those days. Andrew's also pointed out that because of the internet and email and all of these things, pockets of opposition around the country, or pockets of support, could unite very effectively via technology. They could, if Archbishop, and again, stick with Archbishop Spiridon, if Spiridon did something in one city, that was quickly communicated to another part of the country, and therefore the electronic reaction could be very swift from around the country, and therefore then ultimately around the world. We still don't know the effects of the internet on those days, and we're still dealing with it, though, very much so. Yeah. So yeah, and it does all kinds of websites ever since opposing someone who gets elected as a hierarch in our church at some point. It just seems like an inevitable fate of becoming a bishop in the church, that there will be a website against you.
Just follow-on comment, very much, if we want to look at some parallel case, I would look at His Grace Nikolai Sorich in Alaska. Again, all sorts of charges, all sorts of facts communicated, and it becomes, rather than being a local problem of the Alaskan diocese, it becomes a nationwide or even a worldwide sort of discussion. And what I'm wondering is whether the church has any canonical process that it has actually developed to be an adequate forum to develop, to respond in an agile way to charges, to allegations and to developments.
Can I just comment as a lawyer who deals with stuff like this in the church all the time? I mean, and you're the canonist. You know, these canons were developed in a completely different age, in a completely different context. They embody principles that I think are in many cases kind of principles that can't be changed, right? But a lot of those principles, like principles of due process, that kind of thing, right? But the way those get manifested throughout history, we've had this kind of ossification. We've not even, there have been canonical developments that have never been codified properly. You know, decisions, canonical sort of canon-like decisions in the last 500 years that have sort of never made their way into any kind of organized set of anything, right? Because we haven't had our house in order for 500 plus years. And so I think there's a huge project that's needed to take the principles of the past and bring them into the modern age without losing the core principles. That's something I deal with on a daily basis, and I think it's it's a huge, huge problem, because we can't just say, well, Canon 6 says this, and that's all, because it obviously doesn't deal with the circumstances we're talking about today, where you've got internet allegations, or you've got maybe this credible claim in a court, or this. It's the Byzantine era or the Roman era doesn't give us everything we need to deal with the problems of the present day.
So just two brief comments, because I don't want to dominate this discussion, but it is a canonical sort of problem. One thing is that we have, I think you're pointing to the fact that in terms of formal legislation, the church's formal legislation is to create canons, and obviously we haven't been doing that since the 8th century. So there's a problem there, that we now have informal means of legislation that we are using in order to regulate our canonical life. These come through the Episcopal acceptance of canonical works or other canonical forms of literature. So constitutions, regulations, synodal decisions, canonical questions and answers, canonical treatises, all are received through the apostolic ministry of the hierarchy. And it leads to, there's a good point in that it is a form of legislation and canonical development, but there's a danger in it of isolation and an inconsistency that can lead to fragmentation in the church, which we sadly see going on today.
And selective enforcement.
And well, and I think there's a wider problem, and that wider problem is the appropriation of our canonical tradition. That is the wider problem. And so we now face new technologies, and I see the era of Archbishop Spiridon. I see the ministry of His Grace Bishop Nikolai Soric. I see these are indications of warning signs to the church that it needs to appropriate its canonical tradition in a way that is responsive to the world.
One of the most difficult things to do if you're a historian is to do the history of the more recent past, the history of the present, as some have said. And we've sat through an excellent panel. With Alexander, resonates. I didn't know those details about Athenagoras, but yeah, Athenagoras, right. And 100% agreement with what you said, Father, about Archbishop Michael. I was intrigued by the presentation on Archbishop Demetrius. I think it's a model way of doing recent history. I thought it was wonderfully balanced, soft criticism, but I really, I think we're all now leaving, rethinking what we thought about Archbishop Demetrius. I have Now, I have a thought that came out of what you said, and you weren't naming names, obviously, and nor will I, so I will, this is a working hypothesis. If the criticisms that came towards the end of Archbishop Demetrius' tenure were coming from leading lay people, from wealthy Greek Americans, let me put it that way. And by the same token, Archbishop Demetrius benefited from this in his early part of his tenure by the support of other wealthy Greek Americans. This is just a hypothetical thought. If this is true, I'm wondering what's happening with the church. Athinagoras, in a sense, controlled the laity, as we've heard, to the benefit of the church. Might the church's need for finances and support mean that it can become dependent on wealthy Greek Americans, and then some Greek Americans can turn against Archbishop Demetrius the way they did?
Well, of course, the dependence on finances and wealth is a perennial issue of centuries for the church, and that's not going to go away. As far as who were the opponents, I do not have any information from background sources. I have refrained from gossip as much as I can. Also, I have respected the sanctity of personal relationships, and I have not even asked my friend the Archbishop who he thinks were his primary opponents. So I only have the benefit of the newspapers and impressions. And my impression is, maybe not correct, that it was a group of clergy and lay people, especially in the New York area, who decided at some point that the tenure of the Archbishop was no longer benefiting the mission of the church, and it was time for him to resign. And one person even wrote an article suggesting to the Archbishop, Your Eminence, now you know it's time, as if the Archbishop didn't know the factors of the ecumenical patriarchate, the Archdiocese, and his own considerations when to submit. I thought that particular person had benefited over and over from the Archbishop, and yet he dared to do that. I'm sorry for that, and that these things happen in the church, which should be a loving community. However, the Archbishop stood tall, accepted that errors were made, and in the end resigned, according to his judgment and comfort.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists and to everyone who posed questions. I think a round of applause is appropriate for our speakers. And now please feel free to take a little bit of just a short break. At 4 o'clock we will begin the next session. It is a very short break, perhaps 2 minutes.